So you're going to hear a lot of griping, complaining by almost everybody, right? Like we all do these kind of things. It's not just the professors that do this in private, where we gripe and complain about how things actually work. We wring our hands. We're sort of frustrated, but there's very few people that will actually do something about it, try to move the needle, try to push forward. And then there's this crazy belief that if you're to do it, right, like try to move the needle in your life, and we all have this problem, but there's this crazy belief that when you try to go move the needle, you're sort of doing something that should be really big. And if it's not big and bold, and it's just like the craziest media that is sold to us, right? It's not, and it's just general consensus within culture. Broadly speaking, the number of different people that you're doing that you interact with, they'll all say, it should be something that's big. I was just having this conversation with my son today about, what to really great universities look for in terms of getting them to go there. And yes, you need stellar grades and high, scores and all that kind of stuff, but they also are looking for, big grand, did you tackle something or whatever, right? Like, um, are you a mover and shaker? But I think that the view is very flawed. So that view that you have to, and perhaps it's just me, right? Like I'm at fault with this, is that you have to sort of do something that has this massive impact, and if you don't do it, then you're garbage. If you don't have those results, you're garbage, right? But when you do this, just know when you do something in your immediate area, when you do something, it's usually really tiny. It's not that big of a deal that happens. Um, the person that I probably have can thank the most for this is my mom. Um, even my dad, I reflect on my mom a lot more because she's still alive. My dad has been long passed away, and what they did, right? They would gripe and complain, and they have very different views than me. I get it. They're very much more, and be considered kind of a, radical, I guess. Um, but I'm really not. But in a lot in their view, I had sort of radical beliefs. But you know what I think that they taught me is that yes, they had these sort of very very conservative beliefs, um, but they taught me that you always were just kind and you did like small acts of kindness, right? Like my mom would knit mittens. Um, she still does. That's just like that's her thing that she does. If you ever met my mom, um, and she's less and less mobile now, so it's a little tough for on me. But she still knits her mittens. Um, I can't imagine what she's going through. I think I'm being a little bit selfish here, but she still does her mittens. And my dad would give vegetables. He had a big vegetable garden, and he would give vegetables to different people, potatoes or whatever, extra carrots. They would give it away. Um, and first of all, it's something that I repeatedly feel guilty about not doing. I feel like I'm not a great citizen, because I don't do that. But as much as I should, I try, but I'm not great at it. Um, but they would do these little acts, these little things. Nobody really cared about them. They're really tiny and minor. Um, in the grand scheme of things, nobody's ever going to write a Nobel Prize about my parents. Both of them are, my dad's long past. My mom is, she's getting older in age, and there's no way that anybody's ever going to write anything about them. Um, when they're going to be just part of the past, um, and the present. But But at the same time, these little acts that they did moved the needle. Like they made, I think it was like a great blow. I think about that for the great blow for the community. They moved. So my dad passed away. We lived in this little tiny town of 6,000 people. And he passed away. And they moved back in 2000. My mom moved in 2005. I say they, it's my mom. And she moved, I think, in 2007 away from the tiny town, and where I grew up, um, of Dryden, Ontario. If you ever look it on a map, it's a little tiny place. But I think it was a great blow for the community, and yet the community would never know, right? Like why something wasn't there. They were always really steadfast. They were there in the background. Um, they volunteered heavily at the church. I was deeply involved in the Catholic Church. Growing up, I don't consider myself very religious anymore, but I have many of those values that are instilled in me. But the thing that really is that moved the needle in those little tiny acts, whether it was giving mittens, to different people in the community, whether it was making bread, whether it was giving vegetables away, whether it was, volunteering to clean the church, which I remember vividly growing up with my aunt and my mom, my aunt being a very Polish lady, um, that they would run around, or they would clean and sing and, do prayers in this church. And I would run around as little kids with my sisters in the church and play and do those things. I remember that very vividly, and that was all free of charge. But I think about all these kind of things where nobody's ever going to write, you know, that's not Nobel Prize winning stuff, right? That's not something that's going to get you into Harvard, including with SAT scores and all that kind of stuff. That's not something that is like, oh, I wrote an app and 100 million people, you know, use this thing, that kind of story. But it's actually the thing that matters the most. It is the thing that you're going to expect to happen is if you expect to make an app that gets $100 million users or 100 million users, it will never happen. You will psych yourself up. You will start and it'll fail and you'll say, I can't do this. But if you say, I am going to knit a mitten today, I am going to go and give a little bit of my extra vegetables that I have to my neighbors. And by the way, I have neighbors that are like that today. They're older and they're very sweet. They do things like that. But that's the stuff that actually moves the needle. That's the stuff that you could do. That little smile, um, saying hi. These are the things that you'll never write about, but they change everything. They are the glue. They are the thing that establishes us as humans. And there's nothing fancy there. I'm not gonna, write that my parents were, doctors and lawyers and, you know, uh, everything else. I'm not gonna write that kind of stuff. I'm gonna say that they were the type of people that you wanted as your neighbors and you want them in your community. And I think that is the thing that everybody should seek, is those tiny little things that forever matter and imprint in, 4-year-old that's watching and looking and saying, that's how I want to live my life, is to live modestly, with a lot of humility, with a lot of joy, frustrations, obviously, that we all frustrate with, but at the same time, they actually did something. Not all the time, but they did something to move the needle. And, if you're to listen to this, that's the only lesson that I want you to take away from anything they ever tell you, is you move the needle with something small, something very, very humble, something like mittens, something like going and shoveling snow for your neighbor, something like saying hi and having a conversation, either in the hallway or to neighbors or even to your kids or your family or your parents. I think those little things are the things that actually do count. They're the things that actually build humanity. They're neglected, they're not recognized, but they're the things that we need. And they're the things that you can do. And they're the things that will forever change who you are. Take care and have a wonderful day.